the cousin to fair use, arguably its lesser cousin, is Ben fair dealing, which exists in most common law countries that are UK or have a UK origin or once part of the UK. And that, our neighbor to the north, Canada, has fair dealing, for example. During Fair Use Week, they celebrated Fair Dealing Week. Over time, fair dealing has expanded beyond its traditional roots, though, and that's good, and I think that has to do with the U.S. influence a lot. But the concept here is that fair dealing partitions certain categories of fair use-like rights. So there'll be a fair dealing in research, fair dealing in educational use, fair dealing with news reporting. They categorically break it down so that you have to fall in one of these fair dealing categories in order to allow that type of fair use, even though it's fair dealing. So some folks find the categories to be restrictive. Obviously, if you don't fall in category 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it may be, then maybe you don't have a fair use or a fair dealing. But as we know, technology, scholarship, etc., news reporting, the way all these things are done now are pushed beyond simple categories. And that's why a lot of people prefer the fair use methodology, in that it was built back in 1976 when it was being written to be flexible for all forms of comment, criticism, research, news reporting, classroom use. Those 4 factors are flexible. They're not naming a category. They're not naming a specific thing. Research, okay, news reporting, okay, educational use. So that's why some people prefer fair use to fair dealing. However, in those jurisdictions that do have fair dealing right now, and let's say Canada is one, there's actually been a great amount of influence from the U.S. courts on their concept of fair dealing. In fact, a lot of important decisions, the CCH decision, I'm not going to cite decisions here, but have looked to the American fair use common law, meaning the cases, to see if it can be expanded or influenced by that decision. Now, that has happened in Canada. It has also happened most recently in India. India has a fair dealing clause. I believe it's section 52 of their Copyright Act. And it outlines, as I said, the different categories of use, but in the cases that have addressed fair dealing, most recently, you see references to HathiTrust. And Authors Guild for HathiTrust and Google Books, and you see them looking at transformative fair use. Now, that's something that doesn't necessarily exist inside their jurisdiction, inside their statutes. They're a fair dealing jurisdiction. But nevertheless, you see the Indian courts are being influenced by this U.S.-led transformative fair use law. So they may actually apply some of this. Now, they can't apply the law itself. That would be against the laws. Internationally, you can only apply the law that exists in your jurisdiction. But you absolutely can be influenced in how the factors are read. In other jurisdictions, they may call it fair dealing, but it may have elements of fair use. There are certain island nations and other states, I think Antigua, don't quote me on that, that have a 4-factor test that's under fair dealing. But that 4-factor test looks awfully like fair use. And in fact, a lot of the fair dealing, they do have these factors tests that do look a little bit like fair use. So it's related. And conceptually, it makes sense because the concept of fair use was brought over from England. In 1841, they didn't just invent it here in Massachusetts, it was enforced here, but they looked to previous cases from English common law. And so, you can see how the influence was related. So it makes sense that these are cousins. But the way it was adopted into our code as fair use is what makes us unique. It's also what makes Israel unique. Israel has fair use, very similar language to ours. The Philippines has fair use, very similar language to ours. And as I said, there are a few other jurisdictions that have a fair use like 4-factor test, sometimes 5. But the concept there is it looks a little bit like fair use. But again, the majority of the world is a fair dealing world, which is categorically